The thundering sound of hooves pounding against the hard-packed earth was drowned by the furious roar of the swollen river as Jessamine Porter raced through the darkening plains of Montana Territory. The year was 1878, and the spring thaw had turned the normally placid river into a raging monster that devoured everything in its path. Her chestnut mare, Penny, snorted with fear as they galloped parallel to the churning waters, the beast sensing danger long before her rider. "Come on, girl," Jessamine urged, her honey blonde hair whipping wildly from beneath her wide-brimmed hat. At 22, she had grown up on these lands, but never had she seen the river so angry, so determined to reclaim territory that humans had dared to settle. Behind her, the settlement of Willow Creek was already flooding. She had ridden out to warn the outlying homesteaders after spotting the first surge of water breaking through upstream. The Donovan family was safe, as were the Wilsons, but she still needed to reach the Henderson place before the water did. The sky darkened ominously as twilight settled over the land. Jessamine glanced nervously at the river beside her. The water was rising faster than she'd anticipated, eating away at the cutbank that separated her from the raging torrent. She needed to veer away, find higher ground, but the terrain ahead narrowed between the river and the steep bluffs to her right. A crack split the air, loud as a gunshot. Jessamine pulled hard on the reins as the ground beneath Penny's hooves began to crumble. The mare reared in panic, nearly throwing her rider. Whoa! Jessamine fought to control her mount, but it was too late. The cutbank was collapsing, sliding into the river in great chunks of mud and grass. Penny scrambled backward, wild with fear, as the solid ground beneath them rapidly disappeared. Jessamine's heart hammered in her chest. They were trapped on a narrow strip of land that was vanishing by the second. The bluffs rose sharply on her right, impossible to scale on horseback, while the hungry river devoured the earth on her left. "Help!" she screamed, though she knew it was futile. The nearest homestead was still a mile ahead, and the roar of the river would swallow her cries. But then, incredibly, a figure appeared atop the bluff above her. A rider on a black horse silhouetted against the darkening sky. The figure disappeared momentarily, then reappeared farther down where the bluff sloped less steeply. The rider was tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He guided his mount expertly down the treacherous slope, sliding and scrambling to reach the narrow ledge where Jessamine clung with her panicking horse. "Let the horse go." The man called out, his deep voice carrying over the roar of the water. "I can't," Jessamine cried. Penny was more than transportation, she was family. The man dismounted, tying his own horse securely to a sturdy bush. He approached cautiously, hands outstretched. "The river broke through the cutbank at night," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "We don't have much time." As if to emphasize his words, another large section of earth collapsed into the river behind Jessamine. Penny whinnied in terror, her eyes rolling white. The cowboy moved closer, his features becoming clearer in the fading light. He was younger than Jessamine had first thought, perhaps 25, with striking blue eyes and a strong, square jaw darkened with stubble. "My name's Xavier Garrett," he said, moving slowly toward her. "I've been tracking this flood since upstream. Your horse won't make it up that slope, and we've got minutes before this whole bank goes." Another chunk of earth disappeared. Penny reared again, and Jessamine barely maintained her seat. "I can't leave her," Jessamine insisted, tears stinging her eyes. Xavier reached them now, placing a steadying hand on Penny's bridle. "She'll follow the riverbank down to open ground if you let her go. Horses are smarter than people about survival." His eyes locked with hers. "Trust me." Something in his gaze convinced her. Jessamine slid from the saddle, her legs nearly buckling as she hit the ground. She pressed her face against Penny's neck. "Go on, girl," she whispered, removing the bridle with shaking hands. She slapped the mare's flank, and with a final frightened whinny, Penny bolted away, following the narrowing strip of land downstream. The ground trembled beneath them. Xavier grabbed Jessamine's hand and pulled her toward the bluff. They had only moments before the entire ledge would collapse. "We'll never make it up with both of us on my horse," Xavier said, eyeing the steep incline. "I need to get you up first." He positioned himself at the base of the slope, his back to the bluff, hands cupped before him. "Step into my arms and jump," he instructed, his voice calm despite the urgency of their situation. "I'll boost you high enough to reach that outcropping." Jessamine hesitated only a second before placing her foot in his cupped hands. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them, trust, perhaps, or something more. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, and he counted 1, 2, 3. With a powerful thrust, Xavier launched her upward. Jessamine's hands found the rocky outcropping, and she scrambled to pull herself up as the ground where Xavier stood began to give way. "Xavier," she screamed, reaching back down toward him. He leapt for the rock face, his strong fingers finding purchase in the nearly vertical wall. With remarkable strength, he pulled himself up beside her, panting. "That was close," he breathed, but there was no time for relief. "Keep climbing." Together they scaled the bluff, finding footholds in the rocky face, helping each other when the way seemed impossible. When they finally reached the top, they collapsed onto solid ground, gasping for breath. Below them, the ledge where they had stood moments before crumbled completely into the raging river. "My horse," Xavier said suddenly, standing to look down the bluff. Jessamine rose beside him, following his gaze. The black stallion had freed itself from the bush and was picking its way carefully along what remained of the bank, following Penny's path downstream. "Smart animal," Jessamine said. "Like you said, horses know how to survive." Xavier turned to look at her fully for the first time. His blue eyes widened slightly as he took in her appearance, her honey blonde hair now falling loose around her shoulders, her determined green eyes, the smudge of dirt across one cheek. "You're from Willow Creek?" he asked. "Born and raised." "I'm Jessamine Porter." She extended her hand, suddenly conscious of how forward the gesture might seem. Ladies didn't typically shake hands with strange men, but nothing about this situation was typical. Xavier took her hand without hesitation, his grip firm but gentle. "Miss Porter." "Brave of you to be out warning folks." "My father's the sheriff," she explained. "He went north to warn the ranches there. I took the southern route." A sudden gust of wind made Jessamine shiver. Night had fallen completely now, and without the exertion of their climb, the April chill cut through her damp clothing. "We need shelter," Xavier said, looking around. "There's a line shack about half a mile from here, used by the Circle G ranch hands during roundup. We can wait out the night there." "Circle G, you work for Mr. Grayson," Xavier smiled, a brief flash of white teeth in his tanned face. "I own the Circle G, inherited it from my uncle last year." Jessamine tried to hide her surprise. Everyone in the territory knew of the Circle G, one of the largest cattle operations in the region, but she hadn't heard that ownership had changed hands. "Let's get moving," Xavier said, offering her his arm. "It's getting colder and those clouds don't look friendly." As if on cue, a fat raindrop splashed against Jessamine's cheek. They hurried across the high ground, the wind picking up and driving the rain into their faces. By the time the small line shack came into view, they were both soaked to the skin and shivering. The shack was little more than a one-room cabin with a small stove, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot pushed against the far wall. It smelled of smoke and leather and men who spent too many days away from proper bathing facilities, but to Jessamine, it was a palace compared to the storm outside. Xavier busied himself with starting a fire in the small stove, while Jessamine stood awkwardly in the center of the room, water dripping from her clothes to form puddles on the plank floor. "There are some spare clothes in that trunk," Xavier said without looking up from his task. "Ranch hands keep extras here, nothing fancy, but they'll be dry." Jessamine hesitated, then moved to the wooden trunk and lifted the lid. Inside were several flannel shirts, a pair of denims, and some woolen socks. She selected the smallest shirt and a pair of socks. "I'll step outside while you change," Xavier offered, rising as the fire caught. "No," Jessamine said quickly, thinking of the storm. "Just turn your back, please." Xavier nodded and faced the wall. Jessamine changed as quickly as she could, peeling off her sodden dress and petticoats and pulling the flannel shirt over her head. It hung nearly to her knees, the sleeves dangling well past her fingertips. She rolled them up and pulled on the dry socks. You can turn around now, she said, gathering her wet clothes and draping them over the backs of the chairs to dry. Xavier had removed his wet coat, but remained in his damp shirt and trousers. He raised an eyebrow at her appearance but said nothing, moving instead to a small cupboard. Let's see what supplies we have, he said, rummaging through the shelves. Beans, coffee, jerky, not exactly a feast, but it'll do. As he prepared a simple meal, Jessamine studied him surreptitiously. Xavier Garrett was not what she had expected of the Circle GTK's owner. He worked with the ease and familiarity of someone who had done physical labor all his life, not like the Eastern dandies who sometimes bought ranches as playthings. His hands were calloused, his movements efficient, his manner direct. How long have you been in Montana territory? She asked, breaking the silence. Came out with my uncle as a boy about 15 years ago, Xavier replied, measuring coffee into a battered pot. Been here ever since, except for 2 years back east at school. Uncle Thomas insisted, said a modern rancher needed book learning. He shrugged. I came back the minute I was done. And your parents, Jessamine prompted, a shadow crossed his face, lost them both to fever in Ohio when I was 10. Uncle Thomas was my only kin. I'm sorry, Jessamine said softly. My mother passed when I was 12. It's just been my father and me since then. Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. They fell silent as he finished preparing the simple meal, the only sounds the howling wind outside and the crackling of the fire in the stove. They ate sitting cross-legged on the floor, the beans surprisingly tasty after their ordeal. The coffee warmed Jessamine from the inside, and she found herself relaxing despite the strange circumstances. Thank you, she said suddenly, for saving my life. Xavier looked up, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. Anyone would have done the same. No, Jessamine shook her head. Not everyone would have risked their life for a stranger. His lips curved slightly. Well, Miss Porter, I couldn't very well let the sheriff's daughter drown, could I? I'd never hear the end of it. There was a teasing note in his voice that made Jessamine smile. I suppose not. Still, I'm grateful. Xavier set aside his empty plate. We should try to get some sleep. You take the cot, I'll make do on the floor. Jessamine frowned. That hardly seems fair. You're the one who saved me. I'm also the one who slept in this lined shack 100 times before, he countered. Trust me, the floor and I are old friends. Reluctantly, Jessamine agreed. Xavier found an old blanket in the trunk and made himself a pallet near the stove while she settled onto the narrow cot. Do you think the flooding will reach Willow Creek? She asked as she lay down. Hard to say. The river was already over its banks upstream, but the town sits higher than the surrounding land. Your father was right to warn the outlying homesteads, though. Jessamine stared at the rough-hewn ceiling. I hope Penny made it safely downstream. Horses are survivors, Xavier assured her. She'll find her way home when the water recedes. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, and the wind occasionally rattled the single window, but inside the small cabin, warmth and exhaustion soon lulled Jessamine toward sleep. Xavier, she murmured, her eyes growing heavy. I'm glad it was you who found me. She didn't hear his response as sleep claimed her, but she thought she saw a smile touch his lips in the firelight. Morning arrived with startling brightness. The storm had passed during the night, leaving a washed and gleaming world behind. Jessamine woke to the smell of coffee and found Xavier already up, tending the stove. Your clothes should be dry, he said by way of greeting. I'll step outside while you dress. True to his word, Xavier disappeared through the door, giving Jessamine privacy to change back into her own clothing. Her dress was still slightly damp in places but wearable, and it felt good to be properly clothed again, though she found herself reluctant to part with the comfortable warmth of the flannel shirt. When she emerged from the cabin, she found Xavier standing on a rise, surveying the landscape. The river was visible in the distance, still swollen and brown with mud, but no longer the raging monster of the previous night. How bad is it? She asked, joining him. Could have been worse. The water's already receding. Another day or two, and the river should be back in its banks. He turned to her, his expression concerned. Your father will be worried. Yes, Jessamine agreed. I should get back to town as soon as possible. My horse should have made his way to lower ground downstream, Xavier said. I'll find him and we'll ride to Willow Creek together. It took them nearly an hour of walking to locate Xavier's black stallion, which they found grazing contentedly in a meadow alongside several other horses that had apparently been displaced by the flood. To Jessamine's delight, Penny was among them, looking no worse for her adventure. See. "Survivors," Xavier said with a grin as Jessamine rushed to embrace her mare. With both horses recovered, they made good time to Willow Creek. The small town was bustling with activity as residents assessed flood damage and began cleanup efforts. Several buildings near the river had water damage, but the town's elevated position had spared it from the worst of the flooding. Sheriff John Porter was directing a group of men stacking sandbags when Jessamine and Xavier rode in. His weathered face lit up with relief when he spotted his daughter. "Jessie, thank God," he rushed to help her dismount, enveloping her in a fierce hug. "When you didn't return last night, I feared the worst." "I'm fine, Pa," Jessamine assured him. "Thanks to Mr. Garrett here." Sheriff Porter turned to Xavier, extending his hand. "Xavier Garrett." "Thomas Garrett's nephew." "Yes, sir." Xavier dismounted and shook the sheriff's hand. "The river broke through the Cutbank and nearly took your daughter with it. We took shelter in one of my line shacks for the night." A flicker of concern crossed the sheriff's face. A night alone with a man, even in such circumstances, could be fodder for gossip, but he simply nodded. "I'm grateful to you, son. The Porters are in your debt." "No debt necessary, Sheriff. Anyone would have done the same." "Well, the least we can do is offer you a proper meal. Our house was spared any damage, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, always cooks enough for an army." Xavier glanced at Jessamine, something unreadable in his blue eyes. "That's kind of you, sir, but I should get back to my ranch. My foreman will be worried and will likely have strays to round up after the flood." Disappointment washed through Jessamine, though she kept her expression neutral. "Of course. Thank you again, Mr. Garrett." Xavier tipped his hat to her, a half-smile on his lips. "Miss Porter." "It was my pleasure." He turned to the sheriff. "I'll be bringing a herd to market in 2 weeks' time. Perhaps I might call on you then, Sheriff, see how the town's recovery is progressing." Sheriff Porter nodded, oblivious to the way his daughter's heart had suddenly accelerated. "You'd be welcome anytime, son." With a final nod to Jessamine, Xavier mounted his stallion and rode out of town. She watched him go, a strange sense of loss settling over her despite the brevity of their acquaintance. "Quite a young man," her father commented as they led Penny toward home. Thomas Garrett was one of the finest ranchers in the territory. If his nephew is half the man he was, the Circle G is in good hands. "Yes," Jessamine agreed absently, her thoughts still on Xavier's parting look, that curious mixture of regret and promise. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. The flood waters receded, leaving behind mud and debris that required countless hours of cleanup. Jessamine divided her time between helping at home, assisting neighbors, and volunteering at the small schoolhouse where several families had taken temporary shelter. She told herself she wasn't counting the days until the Circle G herd would arrive in Willow Creek, but each morning, her eyes drifted to the calendar on the kitchen wall. She had met countless men in her 22 years, danced with them at socials, shared conversation after church, even allowed a few to court her briefly. But none had occupied her thoughts the way Xavier Garrett did after a single night in his company. It was foolish, she knew. He was a rancher with responsibilities, likely too busy for courting. And what had he really said? Only that he might call on her father, nothing more. Still, when the dust cloud of an approaching cattle herd appeared on the horizon exactly 2 weeks after their parting, Jessamine found herself changing into her best day dress, a becoming pale blue that brought out the green of her eyes. "Going somewhere special, Mrs.?" Finch asked with a knowing smile as Jessamine pinned up her hair with particular care. "Just into town," Jessamine replied, feigning nonchalance. "We need more sugar, and I thought I'd check on the Widow Simmons while I'm out." Mrs. Finch hummed skeptically, but said nothing more. The main street of Willow Creek was busy with the arrival of the Circle G herd. Cowboys guided the cattle toward the stockyards at the edge of town, while townspeople looked on, accustomed to the periodic disruption, but still finding it a welcome distraction from the flood cleanup. Jessamine made her purchases at the general store, exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Simmons, and was beginning to think she had miscalculated when a familiar voice called her name. "Miss Porter." She turned to find Xavier Garrett approaching, his hat in hand. He was freshly shaven, his dark hair still damp from washing, and wore a clean shirt beneath his vest. The transformation from the mud-splattered cowboy who had saved her was striking. "Mr. Garrett," she greeted him, hoping her voice didn't betray her pleasure at seeing him. "I see your herd arrived safely." "Just over 1,000 head," he confirmed. "The flood scattered some, but we found most. How has Willow Creek fared in the cleanup?" "Better than expected. Most buildings were spared serious damage." They stood in awkward silence for a moment until Xavier cleared his throat. "I was hoping to speak with your father. Is he at the sheriff's office?" "Yes, he should be there all afternoon." Jessamine hesitated, then added, "I was just heading home. Would you like to walk with me?" "Our house is on the way." Xavier smiled, and Jessamine felt her pulse quicken. "I'd be honored, Miss Porter." As they walked along the boardwalk, Jessamine was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople. Xavier Garrett was considered one of the territory's most eligible bachelors, and his appearance at her side would certainly set tongues wagging. "I wanted to thank you properly," Xavier said as they turned onto the residential street where the Porter home stood. "The night of the flood, you handled yourself with remarkable courage. I seem to recall spending most of the time being rescued by you," Jessamine replied with a small laugh. "Not many women would have ridden out to warn homesteaders in the first place," Xavier countered. "Most would have stayed safely in town." They reached the white picket fence that surrounded the Porter home, a modest but well-maintained two-story house with a wide porch. Jessamine paused at the gate, reluctant for their conversation to end. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she offered. "Mrs. Finch always keeps a pot ready." Xavier glanced at the house, then back to her, genuine regret in his eyes. "I should find your father first. Business matters." He hesitated, then added, "But perhaps I might call on you this evening. Properly, I mean." Jessamine's heart leapt. "I would like that very much. Until this evening, then." Xavier tipped his hat and turned back toward town, leaving Jessamine standing at her gate with a smile she couldn't suppress. True to his word, Xavier appeared at the Porter home that evening, dressed in his best clothes and bearing a small bouquet of wildflowers. Sheriff Porter greeted him warmly and invited him into the parlor, where Jessamine waited, her nerves fluttering like hummingbird wings. The evening passed in pleasant conversation. Xavier spoke of his plans for the Circle G, how he hoped to introduce some Eastern breeding stock to improve his herd, and his ideas for expanding the ranch's operations. Sheriff Porter, clearly impressed, shared stories of the territory's early days when he had first arrived as a young deputy with a wife and infant daughter. "It was a wild place then," the sheriff reminisced. "Not that it's exactly tame now, but we've made progress." When Xavier finally took his leave, Sheriff Porter excused himself tactfully, allowing the young people a moment alone on the porch. "I enjoyed this evening," Xavier said, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. "As did I," Jessamine replied, equally quiet. "I'll be in town for 3 days, seeing to the sale of the herd," Xavier continued. "Would it be too forward to ask if I might call on you again tomorrow?" Jessamine smiled. "Not too forward at all, Mr. Garrett. Xavier, please." After sharing a lined shack during a flood, I think we can dispense with formalities. "Xavier," she agreed, "and you must call me Jessamine." He took her hand then, his touch sending a thrill through her despite the propriety of the gesture. "Good night, Jessamine, until tomorrow." For the next 3 days, Xavier called at the Porter home each evening. They talked for hours, discovering shared interests and complementary differences. On the 3rd evening, Sheriff Porter again discreetly left them alone on the porch as Xavier prepared to depart. "I ride back to the Circle G tomorrow," Xavier said, his reluctance evident. "Yes, I know." Jessamine tried to hide her disappointment. "It's a half-day's ride from Willow Creek," Xavier continued. "Not so far that a man couldn't make the journey regularly if he had reason to." Jessamine looked up at him, hope rising. "And does he have reason?" Xavier took both her hands in his. "I believe he does, if the lady would welcome his visits." "She would," Jessamine whispered. "Very much." In the soft glow of the porch lantern, Xavier's eyes were impossibly blue. He leaned forward slowly, giving her ample time to turn away if she wished. But Jessamine remained perfectly still as his lips met hers in a gentle, brief kiss her first. "Until next time, Jessamine Porter," Xavier murmured as he stepped back. "Until next time, Xavier Garrett." True to his word, Xavier returned to Willow Creek the following Saturday, and the next, and the next. Throughout the summer of 1878, his visits became a regular feature of Jessamine's life, something she anticipated with growing affection. They rode together across the rolling hills surrounding Willow Creek, picnicked by clear streams, and danced at the town's Independence Day celebration. With each meeting, their bond deepened, moving beyond initial attraction to genuine understanding and respect. In August, Xavier invited Jessamine to visit the Circle G, properly chaperoned by Mrs. Finch, of course, as Sheriff Porter made clear when granting his permission. The ranch was impressive, a sprawling main house built of solid timber, numerous outbuildings, corrals, and bunkhouses for the ranch hands. But more impressive to Jessamine was watching Xavier in his element, respected by his men, knowledgeable about every aspect of the operation, and clearly passionate about the land and animals under his care. "My uncle built most of this," Xavier told her as they sat on the wide porch of the main house looking out over the ranch yard. "I've added the new stables and that bunkhouse." He pointed to a structure at the edge of the complex. "Next spring, I plan to expand the house itself." There was a question in his eyes that he didn't voice, but Jessamine felt its weight nonetheless. The expansion of the house suggested permanence, family, a future beyond solitary ranching. "It's a beautiful home," she said softly. "Anyone would be proud to live here." Xavier's smile was radiant. "I'm glad you think so." As summer faded into autumn, their courtship continued. Xavier was in Willow Creek more frequently now, overseeing the shipping of cattle to eastern markets and making arrangements for winter supplies. Each visit included time with Jessamine, and the town watched with approving eyes as the relationship between the sheriff's daughter and the rancher blossomed. In late September, Xavier arrived in Willow Creek unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon. Jessamine was helping at the church's sewing circle when Mrs. Finch appeared at the door, slightly breathless. "Jessamine, dear, you have a visitor at home," the housekeeper said, her eyes twinkling. Excusing herself from the other ladies, Jessamine hurried home to find Xavier waiting in the parlor, unusually formal in a suit and string tie. "Xavier, is something wrong?" she asked, concerned by his unexpected appearance. "Nothing's wrong," he assured her, taking her hands. "I had business in town and couldn't bear the thought of not seeing you." Relief washed through her. "Well, I'm always happy to see you." Xavier seemed uncharacteristically nervous, shifting his weight and clearing his throat. "Actually, Jessamine, there was another reason for my visit. I've spoken with your father this morning and, well..." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Jessamine's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a modest but brilliant diamond. "It was my mother's," Xavier explained, his voice husky with emotion. "My uncle kept it for me all these years." He sank to one knee before her, still holding her hands. "Jessamine Porter, these past months have been the happiest of my life. You're the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears sprang to Jessamine's eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Xavier, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and when he stood, she threw her arms around his neck in a most unladylike display of affection that would have scandalized the sewing circle. Xavier laughed, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around the parlor. When he set her down, they were both breathless and grinning. "Your father suggested a December wedding," Xavier said. "Before the worst of winter sets in, but after the fall work at the ranch is complete. Would that suit you?" "Perfectly," Jessamine agreed. 3 months seemed both an eternity and no time at all to prepare. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Willow Creek. That evening, neighbors stopped by to offer congratulations, and by the next day, planning for the wedding was already underway. The following months passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Jessamine's wedding dress was sewn with loving care by the ladies of the church, each stitch a blessing for the union to come. The ceremony would be held in the town's small church, followed by a celebration at the Porter home. Xavier rode back and forth between the Circle G and Willow Creek, overseeing ranch operations while also helping with wedding arrangements. The expansion of the main house at the Circle G was completed with remarkable speed, adding 3 new bedrooms and an enlarged kitchen that would be Jessamine's domain as the ranch's new mistress. On December 15, 1878, Jessamine Porter and Xavier Garrett were married in a ceremony that brought together the entire community. The small church was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, filled to capacity with well-wishers from town and ranch alike. Jessamine wore her mother's lace veil with her new dress, carrying a bouquet of hothouse flowers that Xavier had ordered specially from Helena. Sheriff Porter, looking both proud and a little wistful, walked his daughter down the aisle to where Xavier waited, tall and handsome in his new suit. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier's kiss was far less restrained than their first on the Porter porch, drawing good-natured laughter from the congregation. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the territory. As darkness fell, and the newly married couple prepared to depart for their first night as husband and wife at the town's small hotel, Sheriff Porter pulled his daughter aside for a private word. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Jessie," he said, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You've chosen well. He's a good man." "The best," Jessamine agreed, hugging her father tightly. "You'll visit us often at the Circle G. Try and keep me away," the sheriff promised. "Though I'll always give fair warning, no barging in on newlyweds." Jessamine blushed, but laughed along with her father. Their wedding night was everything Jessamine had hoped for: tender, passionate, and filled with the promise of a lifetime together. Xavier was a considerate lover, guiding her through unfamiliar territory with patience and affection that transformed initial nervousness into joy. The next morning, they rode out to the Circle G, Jessamine now mistress of the substantial ranch. The ranch hands had prepared a welcome for the new Mrs. Garrett, hanging a handmade banner across the entrance to the main house and lining up to greet her with awkward but sincere congratulations. Winter settled over the territory, blanketing the land in snow that transformed the landscape into a pristine wonderland. The newlyweds found a comfortable rhythm to their days. Xavier oversaw the ranch operations while Jessamine managed the household, learning from the elderly cook who had served Xavier's uncle for decades. In the evenings, they sat before the fire in the ranch house's comfortable parlor, reading aloud to each other or simply talking. Sometimes they played chess, a game at which Jessamine proved surprisingly skilled, to Xavier's initial chagrin and eventual delight. "You're a woman of hidden talents, Mrs. Garrett," he teased one evening after she had thoroughly trounced him. "Just wait until you taste my apple pie," she retorted with a grin. "Another hidden talent I've been saving." Their nights were as harmonious as their days, a private dance of discovery and pleasure that deepened their connection beyond words. In Xavier's arms, Jessamine found both passion and safety, a place where she could be completely herself. Spring arrived with the usual muddy exuberance of the northern territories. The snow melted, streams overflowed their banks, though thankfully with none of the previous year's drama, and the land came alive with new growth. Jessamine watched the river from the safe distance of the ranch house porch, remembering the night that had changed her life. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked Xavier as he joined her one evening. "About what?" "The flood, the night we met." Xavier slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her close. "Only every day. How could I not be grateful for the river that brought you to me?" "Even though it nearly killed us both?" Jessamine asked with a small laugh. "Even so." Xavier kissed her temple. "Some things are worth the risk." As spring progressed, Jessamine began to suspect a new development in their lives. Her monthly cycle, previously as regular as clockwork, failed to appear. She experienced moments of unexpected fatigue and occasional queasiness in the mornings. She waited until she was certain before sharing the news with Xavier. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in glorious oranges and pinks, she took his hand and placed it gently over her still flat abdomen. "Xavier," she said softly, "we're going to have a baby." His expression transformed from confusion to wonder to joy in the space of heartbeats. "A baby, you're sure?" Jessamine nodded, her own eyes filled with happy tears. "Around Thanksgiving, I think." Xavier whooped with joy, lifting her from her chair and spinning her around much as he had when she accepted his proposal. Then, suddenly remembering her condition, he set her down gently, his hands hovering protectively. "Did I hurt you? Is that safe for the baby?" Jessamine laughed. "We're both fine. The baby is tiny yet, no bigger than a bean." "But growing," Xavier said with wonder, his hand returning to rest on her stomach. "Our child, growing right here." The news of the impending addition to the Garrett family spread quickly. Sheriff Porter rode out to the Circle G as soon as he received Jessamine's letter, his face splitting in a wide grin as he embraced his daughter and shook his son-in-law's hand vigorously. "Grandpa Porter," he said, testing the title. "I like the sound of that." The summer of 1879 passed pleasantly despite Jessamine's expanding waistline and the discomforts of pregnancy during the hot months. Xavier was attentiveness itself, ensuring she rested during the heat of the day and bringing her small treats wild strawberries from a hidden patch near the creek, the season's first apples, even chocolates ordered specially from Helena. As autumn approached, they prepared the nursery in one of the newly added bedrooms. Xavier surprised Jessamine by crafting a cradle himself, working on it secretly in the ranch's workshop during the evenings. "It's beautiful," she exclaimed when he presented it to her, running her hands over the smooth wood polished to a soft gleam. "I wanted our child to have something made with love," Xavier explained, a hint of shyness in his expression that Jessamine found endearing. The baby arrived 2 weeks early, on a cold November night with snow falling gently outside the ranch house windows. The local midwife had been summoned at the first signs of labor, and Sheriff Porter paced anxiously in the parlor while Xavier remained steadfastly at his wife's side throughout the ordeal. After 6 hours of labor, their daughter entered the world with a powerful cry that left no doubt about her healthy lungs. She had Xavier's dark hair, and when she briefly opened them, Jessamine's green eyes. "She's perfect," Xavier whispered, cradling his daughter with hands that easily managed spirited horses but now trembled with the precious weight of this tiny human. "What shall we call her?" Jessamine asked, exhausted but radiant. They had discussed names but hadn't settled on any. Now, looking at their daughter's face, Xavier said, "What about River?" Jessamine raised an eyebrow. "River, because without the river we might never have met," Xavier explained, "and look what that meeting created." He gazed down at their daughter with undisguised adoration. "River Garrett. A name with a story behind it." "River it is," Jessamine agreed, reaching out to touch her daughter's velvet soft cheek. "Welcome to the world, River Garrett." The years that followed were filled with the joys and challenges of family life on a growing ranch. The Circle G prospered under Xavier's management, expanding its holdings and improving its breeding stock until it was known throughout the territory for the quality of its cattle. River grew into a spirited child with her father's determination and her mother's compassion. When she was 3, the family welcomed a son, Thomas, named for Xavier's uncle who had given him his start in life. Through the changing seasons, through droughts and blizzards, through the territory's transition to statehood, the love that had begun on a crumbling riverbank only deepened. Xavier and Jessamine faced each challenge together, their partnership a steady foundation for their growing family. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Jessamine with a special gift, a small gold locket containing a tiny painting of the river where they had met. "To remember where it all began," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "As if I could ever forget," Jessamine replied, touching the locket reverently. "The river broke through the Cutbank at night, and a handsome cowboy said, 'Step into my arms and jump.'" Xavier smiled, drawing her close. "Best jump I ever convinced anyone to make." Best leap of faith I ever took, Jessamine agreed, rising on tiptoe to kiss her husband. Outside their window, the same river that had nearly claimed their lives now flowed peacefully through Circle G land. A constant reminder that sometimes the most dangerous moments could lead to the greatest blessings if one was brave enough to take the leap.